Tales from Juthos, Part 7. Silden sagged, letting a grunt echo out around the small antechamber of the tunnel network. They are in one of the through roads built by the original miners, a method of easy passage between several of the larger tubes that brought clean air down into the city. Long abandoned since the project's completion, these narrow corridors would have been the main method of accessing the then unfinished dig sites. Now beyond the sight and expectations of the city guard, both he and Dogan had taken refuge in a small antechamber that had been carved out of the side of one of these tunnels. Perhaps it had once served as a break area, or maybe a storeroom. The denizens of the slum which lay not far beyond had long since seen to picking the area clear of any refuse that may have betrayed its intended purpose. Setting the Aaaaannd down, the captain heaved a great sigh and collapsed into a seated position against the rough-hewn stone of the wall. A careful arm felt out the space around him, till he felt safe enough to ease into a rest. As he stretched himself back, Dogan could see him flinch in pain as parts of his upper back made contact with the stonework. Pushing his hand beneath his shirt, Silden moved careful fingers against the skin of his right shoulder and neck, letting out pained breaths now and again as he tested the area. Drawing his hand back out from beneath his clothes and licking his fingers, a realization dawned upon the Aaaaannd. It was easy for him to forget that humans couldn't see at all in the dark. He himself could barely see in the tunnels either. Generally, he had to rely upon his ears to get around. But he had been told that humans had it far worse than the simple shades of grey that his own kind could make out. Clearly, he must have gotten too used to Angie's company. Her eyes worked in the darkness just fine, but he knew that was a part of her abnormality. After what felt like a long time, the captain's breath started to ease. He was massaging the base of his missing leg with one hand, undoing the straps of the boot and working the attachment clasps with the other. "They using blunted bolts or something? Or are they just lousy shots?" It took Dogan a little while longer to answer than it could have done. He was amazed. Had he really come all this way through the tunnels without being able to see anything? How? He thought the captain a relative stranger to the area. He doubted that even he could navigate the often treacherous paths with his eyes closed, and he was raised here. I think they call them stone bows." "Stone bows?" The captain sounded curious, then wheezed in relief as the weight of his prosthetic came loose from his stump. Dogan didn't need to be able to see colour to make out that it was bleeding. "Yes, they're like crossbows, but they fire little rocks. Apparently it means the city guard caused less casualties. Are you okay?" The Aaaaannd watched as the captain repeated the ritual of tasting for blood. Licking his lips this time, he frowned and let out a half-sigh, half-pained growl. "Very considerate of them. Listen," he said, shifting his uninjured shoulder and arm out of his coat to rip off the sleeve from his shirt. "I'm going to need you to bind my leg if we're going to be leaving here. If it gets too bad, I'll be in trouble. And that means we'll be in trouble, you hear?" In the darkness, the captain reached forwards with the torn fabric out to the spot where he thought Dogan was standing, his wide and sightless eyes just staring out into empty blackness. Sure." The Aaaaannd took the offered sleeve and tentatively moved closer. As he did so, Silden lifted up his trouser leg to aid in the binding, and in doing so revealed to Dogan the terrible extent of the old injury. The Aaaaannd gagged. So you can see. Interesting." From this close distance, the diminutive creature could make out more details than he cared to. Obscene veins ran through the hairless skin which started just below the knee. Skin which was clumped and seamed in places, as if looking down from above at sun-scorched desert dunes. Behind the knee, what remained of the man-atrophied calf muscle took a different shape to the rest of it, dents in the surface, telling an unpleasant tale of a far from surgical amputation. Towards the base of the leg was no stump of flesh at all, but rather a permanent-looking cylindrical fixture with a receptacle and a clasp mechanism for securing his leg in place. Now, with a chance to inspect this properly, he could see that screws were employed in digging into the flesh and bone to hold this thing in place. And he could run on this? Well, not without injury, so it seemed. For rivulets of blood were seeping from old wounds reopened by the chase. No wonder, then, that he spent so long upon a ship, where lengthy walks were both unnecessary and unavailable. Gritting his teeth, the Seyrat got to work on the bind. Gingerly at first, he was strongly reprimanded and encouraged to "Hurry up, will you? Get the damn job done." The captain groaned in pain as Dogan's long fingers pulled the shirt bandage tight around the caps of the screws. Already, he could see the darkening tones from where the blood was beginning to seep through the coarse fabric. "Give me a moment. That's it. Get off!" snapped Silden. His eyes clenched tight for a moment. He sounded angry, but it was clear to see that this was just a reaction to the injury and renewed pain. The Seyrat hurriedly backed off to the opposite wall, deciding it was clearly best to leave him well enough alone for a short while at least. They were a long way from the noise and clamour of Gren streets, and time had passed enough that his own head was clearing. He felt more focused. Between the relative quiet of the tunnels and the shock from the unsettling reveal of Silden's injuries, he was just about feeling himself again. That was the worst he had been overwhelmed in a long while. The cacophony of screaming from the assembled city folk, twinned with a sudden opening of his ears whilst he was inverted, had caused his mind to just shut down. Unfortunately, this was not an unusual experience for a Seyrat this far from the still air of their ancestral home in the great forest. Yet, having spent so long in the city, he had gotten pretty good at preempting and preventing the experience. Unless it was Ezradis mocking him with the sudden cries of her Skullgarum, of course. As he started to investigate the space, here and there along the floor, Dogan could make out carvings and drawings made with softer stones. They were childlike. Certainly so much so for him to suspect that this place may also serve as something of a hideout for a number of the slum's kids. He hoped that if they were still around, they wouldn't turn up any time soon. The sight of a man like Silden so close to their homes would probably scare them terribly. Enough people were already searching for them without their parents coming to investigate the monster in the maintenance tunnel. When he was feeling just slightly better, he would try listening out for them. Even with Dogan in tow, a little coin offered by the guard for information about Silden's whereabouts would carry a long way amongst the underclass. Behind him, he heard the man shift in his position, his gruff voice calling out to the darkness. "Are you all right?" "If we can get to the slums, I'll be able to find Angie again. It's not far to go." "That isn't what I asked." Why would he care? Not long ago, Silden was threatening him and Angie in the Mountain Heart Tavern. Dogan thought on this for a moment. Silden clearly had no real idea about the nature of the Seyrat. They weren't exactly commonplace. They could be a race of devil adherents for all he knew. Further, whilst Angie didn't look like the beast that supposedly attacked the captain's ship, in either of her forms, he was remarkably quick to take Dogan at his word and let her out into a populated area. He could be sitting on his ship right now awaiting payment. What had changed? What happened between the tavern and the holding that had suddenly... Dogan suddenly recalled the request they join his crew, and his eyes narrowed. "Silden, I've been wondering, before I lead you to the slum, what do you know about us?" the Seyrat asked in a markedly inquisitive tone. Now he knew the captain was injured and effectively sightless. He felt safe enough in the situation to push his luck a bit. This was his home territory after all, and aside from Silden's unusual ability to navigate in the darkness, he had no real reason to believe the captain had ever set foot in the tunnels before. There was a long silence. "I'm interested in saving that companion of yours. I'm also interested in taking you both away from under the boot of that dockmaster. Anyone else telling you that right about now? Something about beggars and choosing?" Silden spoke in a calm enough tone, for him at least, but he remained quite still. Stretching out his wounded leg, he moved the seat of his weight forward as he tried to get more comfortable. "No. Your crew must be in a lot of danger, though. You doing all this seems odd." Dogan responded. He was taken aback as Silden smiled. "Yeah, odd is right. This is all pretty new." He chuckled slightly before wincing as the movement agitated his injured shoulder. "Damn it!" "What happened in the tavern?" "The lights," continued the Seirat, recalling the strange wind rushing through and plunging the place into darkness. "That didn't seem natural." That smile again. It wasn't doing anything to put Dogan at ease, even if it did seem perfectly genuine. "Then you're wrong. As far as I see it, it was the most natural thing in the world." There was a sense of wonderment in his tone. It seemed out of place compared to the rest of his usual demeanour. Dogan thumbed his temples with one hand and ran his fingers through his coarse fur. "Captain, Angie is someone a lot of people are interested in." "Can't imagine why." "Do you know anything about her? What her full name might be, for example?" Dogan watched as Silden reacted to that. He seemed bemused, his nose creasing and a thoughtful yet clearly slightly amused smile still playing upon his face. "Bit of a peculiar thing to specify. I doubt I could give you the full name of four of my crewmen. It ain't too important. No, I don't know your Angie's full name, and nor do I really care to. Should I?" The Seirat focused on the man's heartbeat. It wasn't elevating. He didn't sound insincere either, but then... "Silden, thank you for trusting me thus far, but I need to trust you. I'm about to lead you into my old home, my old people. I need something that will help me make the decision I can trust you. You are a smuggler after all."
"No, I ain't,"
the captain interrupted.
"That was our last run in the smuggler's trade. We don't do that no more."
"Yet, out of the blue, you're asking for me and Angie to join you. You can see why I'd be worried about that." The captain went to speak and then stopped for a moment, slowly turning to face the direction of Dogan's last words in the darkness. "Are you the only one of your kind?" he asked, with a level voice. His breathing was near calm now. There was a renewed potency in his voice. "What? No, of course not. There are loads of us. Do you ever intend on answering one of my questions?"
"We'll get to that. So you reckons I'm on the job to abduct you and your mate for one of these people who are interested in her? But where does a rat come into all that? There's something about you too. Something like the girl? Is that why you're friends, perhaps?"
So this was the sort of perception that afforded a long life in crime. This was Krulleg Silden, the captain of the Aetherling that he had heard so many stories about. It was terrifying. He had deduced more from Dogan's questions than the Seirat had learned from asking them. He really was a dangerous man.
"Nah, I reckon it's different to that," the giant continued. "I reckon it's linked to why you came here of all places when we should be hunting devils. I reckon you're about to have to show me and you're trying to figure out whether or not you should. Is that right?"
Dogan just stood there, silent. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to give this man anything else. He was playing events over in his mind again, wondering if he should just run. But the captain still wasn't finished.
"Listen here. I can't tell you too much. Not right now. But if it helps, I can show you a bit of a trick. Watch. See?
He licked his finger and held it up in front of him, as if testing the wind. Dogan simply nodded. In the tension of the moment, he had all but forgotten the captain's blindness in the dark. Remembering and feeling foolish, he went to speak aloud his affirmation, but all that escaped was a cry. Silden was crying out in pain, screaming even. He had just plunged the presented forefinger deep into his eye socket, and Dogan could see the orb moving and popping as he pushed it from behind. The Seyrot fell backwards in horror. What are you doing?" The fear in his voice, very real. The captain's howling continued. He watched, stunned, as the eye popped clean out of the captain's skull, an empty void all that was left in its space. Dogan scrambled away, only managing to get to his feet once well past the doorway to the antechamber. Pushing his body into action, he was starting to flee, but then he heard laughing. Great, booming and genuine laughter. The Seyrot slowed in his pace. "It's glass, you dolt," called Silden's voice after him between fits of laughter. "You made noise like a strangled hen." Dogan was not impressed. Not in the slightest. You think that's funny?" he shouted behind him into the room. "Damn right I do," called back the laugh. "Anyway, get back in here. If anyone heard that, they'll be coming calling before long. And you ain't seen me finish my trick yet." Silden was holding the glass eye in front of him between 3 fingers of his hand, his arm outstretched and resting on the knee of his good leg. Then he waited. He listened carefully until he heard the Seyrot's footsteps draw closer, though Dogan had no intention of coming any further than the doorway. After this became clear to the captain, he sighed and spoke softer. "Right then, just watch this." He closed his good eye and seemed to be concentrating for a moment. Dogan could see the twitches in his forehead and movement as he muttered quietly beneath his breath. This was a different language. It sounded wispy, ephemeral. Yet it also had a practiced element to it, like a song or a prayer. He didn't know the name of the tongue, if it indeed even had one, but it was, as he would later go on to describe it, more than foreign in its unfamiliarity. Then he watched, as Silden took the glass eye close to his face, pursed his lips, and blew softly upon it. Nothing happened at first. Then, like fanning the embers of a fire, a dim light started to grow within the orb. A white light which swelled and swelled until it lit up the entire of the antechamber. It was a steady light. Unlike a flame, it never waved nor varied. Dogan had to shield his eyes for a moment whilst he took his time to adjust. When he could bear to look on again, he could see the captain sitting there, smiling back at him. "Pretty good, eh?" he said, an excitement in his voice that seemed to jar with the rest of his enormous visage. It was almost childlike. Reaching up to his empty socket again, Dogan turned away to spare himself a second, now coloured ordeal. But there was no screaming this time. When he turned back, Silden had the glowing glass eye in place beside the other, beaming out ahead of him like a lighthouse beacon. "That's a fair bit better, don't you reckon?" Reaching to his side, he grabbed a hold of his prosthetic foot and began the process of reattaching it to its clasps. Far easier, now he could see, it would seem. Dogan simply stood in the doorway, blinking at the peculiar sight of the man with the lighthouse eye. "How in the name of the Eight was that supposed to make me feel any better about guiding you into my home?" There was a mild chuckle from the captain. He snapped the last of the clasps into place, drew himself up onto one knee, and tested the sturdiness of his work upon the floor.
Just thought I'd share.
The Seyrat stood silently as the great man drew himself up to his full height, clearly still unsatisfied.
We're headed to the South Seas after this. You figure it out. Now, come on. Where to?